The heavy, damp air of March 1775 hung over the Watauga River Valley, foretelling a storm that would change the fate of an entire continent. Thousands of people gathered in the clearing at Sycamore Shoals, their hearts beating in unison with the anxious rhythm of drums. Here, beneath the shade of ancient trees, not merely the fate of land parcels was being decided, but the very survival of ancient peoples. Richard Henderson, an ambitious land speculator, laid out a mountain of goods before the Cherokee elders: rifles, cloth, metal tools, and ornaments. In exchange, he demanded a signature, a stroke of a pen that would transfer the colossal territories of Kentucky and Tennessee into the hands of the settlers. The old chiefs, weary of endless skirmishes and seeing the inevitability of the tide of white men, bowed their heads, ready to accept the deal for a phantom peace. It seemed the treaty was already concluded, and history would flow along the channel laid out by the colonists. But suddenly, the crowd parted. A man stepped forward, whose name would soon become a symbol of unyielding resistance for 2 decades. His name was Dragging Canoe. Tall, with a face scarred by smallpox, he possessed a voice capable of overpowering the roar of a mountain river. He refused to shake Henderson's hand. Instead, he pointed west, where the setting sun painted the sky in crimson hues, and uttered words that became a prophecy. He said that the elders might sell the land, but the settlers would have to pay a different price for it. He called these territories __0_, predicting that every cornfield planted there by strangers would be fertilized with fear and despair. This was the moment of rupture. While most Cherokees resigned themselves to the loss, Dragging Canoe and his followers chose a path that led them into the embrace of the British Empire and ignited a war that lasted almost 20 years. To understand the depth of this choice, one must look at the world map of that time through the eyes of the indigenous inhabitants. For the Cherokee, Creek, and Shawnee tribes, the looming American Revolution looked completely different than it did for the residents of Boston or Philadelphia. For the colonists, it was a struggle for freedom from taxes and royal tyranny. But for the Indians, the very word, quote, "one," in the mouths of Americans sounded like a threat. Freedom for a settler meant freedom to move west, cross the Appalachians, clear forests, and enclose hunting grounds with fences. The British Crown, on the contrary, after the 7 Years' War, tried to curb this expansion. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 prohibited colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountain watershed, creating a kind of buffer zone for Indian tribes. Thus, in the brewing conflict, George III paradoxically found himself a defender of the rights of the indigenous population, and the founding fathers of the USA the main threat to their existence. When news of the outbreak of open hostilities between the colonies and the mother country reached the forests of Tennessee, the logic of survival dictated an inevitable alliance. British agents operating on the southern frontier did not merely offer an alliance, they offered technologies for survival. John Stuart, Superintendent of Indian Affairs, played a complex diplomatic game, convincing the tribes that a victory for the colonists would mean the end of their world. Supplies of gunpowder, lead, and muskets flowed from British forts in Florida and Detroit into the hands of Dragging Canoe's warriors. This was not blind submission to an alien will. Indian leaders perfectly understood the geopolitical map. They saw in the British a tool, a powerful lever, with which the tide of settlers could be pushed back beyond the mountains. The conflict, which erupted in 1776, immediately took on the character of a total war of attrition. Dragging Canoe, realizing that traditional tactics of frontal engagements were doomed to fail against a numerically superior enemy, developed a strategy ahead of its time. He led his people, those who refused to accept the sale of lands, away from the old Cherokee towns. They moved south into the hard-to-reach areas along the Tennessee River, where the turbulent waters created a natural fortress. Here, in the area of Chickamauga Creek, they founded new settlements. Thus, a new community was born, which history would remember as the Chickamauga Cherokee. This was not just a tribe, it was a military brotherhood that united irreconcilable warriors from different clans, runaway slaves seeking freedom, and loyalists fleeing the wrath of the revolutionaries. The war on the frontier was characterized by particular brutality and dynamics, completely unlike General Washington's linear battles. There were no clear front lines here. The front was everywhere, on a forest trail, at a solitary farm, at a river ford. The summer of 1776 became a time of fire. Coordinated Cherokee attacks swept through settlements in Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. This was a show of force, intended to shock the colonists and make them flee. However, the effect was the opposite. The attacks united the disparate states in the face of a common threat. The counterattack was devastating. Militia from 4 states invaded Cherokee territory in what was known as, quote, "one." They did not just fight warriors, they destroyed the tribe's economic base. Dozens of towns were burned, winter corn supplies destroyed, and orchards cut down. It was at this moment that the genius and tragedy of the internal Cherokee conflict became apparent. The old chiefs, seeing the devastation of their lands, sued for peace. They were ready to cede even more territory just to preserve the remnants of their people. But Pulling Canoe refused to participate in negotiations. He declared that peace on terms of land loss was a slow demise, worse than any battle. The split was not merely along political lines, it cut through families and clans. Those who remained in the old towns tried to adapt, adopting the white way of life. Those who went with Pulling Canoe to the Chickamauga River chose a path of uncompromising struggle. They became outcasts among their own, but heroes to those who understood that something more than just territory was at stake. It was a fight for the right to live by their own laws, to pray to their own gods, and not to be absorbed by an alien civilization. British support during these years became a vital artery for the Chickamauga resistance. Caravans of weapons arrived through the port of Pensacola and down the Mississippi River. British officers in red coats often fought side by side with Indian warriors, teaching them siege tactics and the use of artillery, although the latter was rare in forest warfare. This alliance, however, was full of internal contradictions. For the British, the Indians were an auxiliary force, a way to divert Continental Army resources from the main theaters of war in the north. For the Indians, the British were temporary fellow travelers. Pulling Canoe and his allies from the Creek, Muskogee, people used the European conflict to achieve their own goals. They hoped that by helping George III suppress the rebellion, they would earn guarantees of the inviolability of their borders. A special role in this confrontation was played by the Creek people. Their confederation, located to the south, was a powerful force that all European powers had to reckon with. Alexander MacGillivray, an outstanding Creek leader, son of a Scottish trader and a French Indian woman, became the architect of a complex diplomatic network. He skillfully maneuvered between the British, Spanish, and Americans, striving to preserve the independence of his people. During the years of the Revolution, the Creeks also sided with Britain, but acted more cautiously than the fierce Chickamauga. They understood that the complete destruction of the American colonies was unlikely and tried not to burn their bridges completely. although their warriors regularly participated in raids on Georgia settlements. The real turning point that changed the nature of the conflict did not occur on the battlefield in the forests of Tennessee, but in distant Paris. The signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially concluded the American War of Independence, came as a real shock to Britain's Indian allies. There was not a word in the treaty about the rights of indigenous peoples. The British Crown, which they had so faithfully defended, simply handed over all lands up to the Mississippi River to the new United States. This was a betrayal of colossal magnitude. Chiefs who had shed blood for the king for years suddenly discovered that their lands had been given to their bitterest enemies without their knowledge. For most observers, the war ended in 1783. But for Dragging Canoe and the Chickamauga, it was just entering its most bitter phase. Now they fought not as allies of an empire, but as lonely defenders of their home. The situation became paradoxical. Formally, there was peace between the USA and Britain, but the war continued to rage on the border, fueled by secret support. Britain refused to immediately abandon its forts in the Great Lakes region, continuing to supply the Indians with weapons, hoping to create a buffer Indian state that would curb the growth of the USA. Spain, which controlled Florida and the mouth of the Mississippi, also joined this game. The Spanish, fearing American expansion, became new patrons of the Chickamauga and Creeks, providing them with gunpowder and refuge. In the mid-80s of the 18th century, the Chickamauga resistance transformed. Realizing that the settlements on Chickamauga Creek had become too vulnerable to American expeditions, Dragging Canoe undertook another daring strategic maneuver. He moved his towns even further into the impregnable gorges of Nickajack and Running Water, where the Tennessee River cuts through the Cumberland Plateau. This place, known as the Five Lower Towns, was a natural fortress, surrounded by mountains and turbulent waters. From here, warriors could control river navigation and launch lightning raids on settlements stretching from Ohio to central Tennessee. The internal world of these settlements was a unique phenomenon. These were not just traditional Indian villages, but multicultural centers of resistance. Here, one could find Shawnee warriors from the north, delegations from the Iroquois, runaway black slaves who became free warriors, and even white renegades who adopted the Indian way of life. It was a kind of international of the frontier, united by a common idea of resistance to expansion. The ideological conflict reached its climax. It was a clash of two philosophies of land use. For the American, land was a commodity, a square on a map that could be bought, sold, fenced, and exploited. For the Indian, land was a mother, a sacred space that was given for use, but not for ownership. Americans saw chaos in the wilderness that needed to be ordered. Indians saw harmony in it that needed to be preserved. Tension grew with each passing year. Settlers, intoxicated by victory over Britain, poured across the mountains by the tens of thousands. The state of Franklin was created, an unrecognized entity built entirely on seized lands. Chickamauga raids became the response to every new settlement. The chronicles of those years are full of descriptions of skirmishes, attacks on boats, ambushes on trails, burned stations. But this was not senseless violence. It was a scorched earth tactic, designed to make the price of colonization unbearably high. Chief Dragging Canoe, already aging but still clear-minded, coordinated actions with the northern tribes, trying to create a united front from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The dream of a united Indian Confederation, which would later inspire Tecumseh, was born here, in the smoke of the campfires of the Five Lower Towns. The culmination of this prolonged drama came in the early 1790s. The new American Republic, having solidified its federal power after the adoption of the Constitution, decided to definitively close the Indian question. President Washington understood that the country could not develop with a constant bleeding wound on its western frontier. Large-scale military campaigns were undertaken. In the north, General Anthony Wayne prepared an army to strike at the Chickamauga's allies in Ohio. In the south, pressure mounted from the Tennessee and Kentucky militias. The death of Dragging Canoe in March 1792 marked the beginning of the end. The legendary chief passed away not from a bullet, but after a night of ritual dances, celebrating a victory over a settler detachment. His departure deprived the movement of its spiritual core. Although resistance continued under his successors, unity began to fray. Spain, preoccupied with European wars, reduced its support. Britain increasingly leaned towards settling relations with the USA. The denouement came in September 1794, just a month after the Northern Allies suffered defeat at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Major James Orr, leading an expedition of over 500 Tennessee and Kentucky militiamen, managed to do what seemed impossible: secretly approach the 5 lower towns. Using guides who knew secret trails, they bypassed patrols and struck at the very heart of the resistance. The towns of Nickajack and Running Water were caught by surprise. The battle was short and tragic. The superior forces of the militiamen, armed with modern artillery and driven by a thirst for revenge for years of fear, swept away the defenders' resistance. The flames that engulfed homes, food supplies, and fields marked the end of the era of the Chickamauga Wars. With the defeat of the main resistance bases, organized struggle on the southern frontier faded. The surviving chiefs were forced to sign peace treaties, finally recognizing the authority of the United States. The Treaty of Tellico in 1798 solidified the loss of vast territories. But the echoes of these events continued to resonate. Those Chickamauga who refused to surrender moved further west, beyond the Mississippi, becoming the first Cherokees in Arkansas, long before the official deportation. The significance of this period cannot be overstated, though it often remains in the shadow of the War of Independence. The Chickamauga Wars showed that the American Revolution was not only a war for political independence from Britain, but also an imperial war for the conquest of a continent. The paradox was that the birth of democracy for some became the beginning of disaster for others. The Indian allies of England were not pawns in someone else's game. They were active players, defending their sovereignty with the means available to them. They chose an alliance with the monarchy against the republic because the monarchy promised the preservation of borders, while the republic brought endless expansion. The lessons of those years resonate even today. The history of Chickamauga reminds us that the progress of one civilization is often built on the ruins of another. The resilience of Dragging Canoe and his people demonstrates the limit of the human spirit in the fight for their native land. They lost militarily, but their resistance delayed the full colonization of the region for decades, allowing the Cherokee culture to adapt and survive in new conditions, at least partially. This period also laid the foundation for future conflicts, defining the character of relations between the U.S. government and indigenous peoples for the next century. When the smoke from the fires cleared over the Tennessee River at the end of the 18th century, the world had changed irrevocably. Dragging Canoe's prophecy of, quote, zero came true in full. The land indeed absorbed much sorrow, but it also remembered the courage of those who dared to defy the inevitable. Today, Looking at the calm waters of the Tennessee River, it's hard to imagine the fury of those battles. But it is in this silence of the landscape that the memory of a time is hidden, when the fate of a continent hung in the balance, and when choosing a side in the conflict meant choosing between life and oblivion. The history of the Chickamauga Wars is not just a chapter in a textbook. It is a reminder of the complexity of historical processes, where there is no absolute good and evil, but only a clash of interests, dreams, and the will to live. Mentally returning to that rainy day in Sycamore Shoals, we see not just a historical scene, but an eternal human story. The moment when one man says no to a superior force, knowing that the chances of victory are negligible, but the struggle is necessary for the preservation of his own dignity and the future of his people. This choice determined the fate of an entire generation and left an indelible scar on the face of the young American nation, reminding us that the price paid for expanding borders is measured not in dollars, but in the destinies of vanished worlds. The legacy of those events can be traced in the fates of descendants. Many Cherokee leaders who later became prominent in the 19th century grew up in the atmosphere of Chickamauga resistance. John Ross, the future principal chief during the tragic Trail of Tears, absorbed the lessons of that era, the impossibility of trusting treaties and the need to seek new ways for the nation's survival. Major Ridge, another key player in the future Cherokee drama, was a young warrior in the Chickamauga detachments. The experience of war against the U.S. taught them that military resistance has its limits and pushed them to attempt to civilize, to create their own writing system, constitution, and government modeled after the American one, an attempt that was heroic but ultimately did not save them from deportation. From a geopolitical perspective, the Chickamauga Wars became the first test for young American diplomacy and its army. It was a proving ground where U.S. policy towards indigenous peoples was formed, a combination of military force, economic pressure, and tribal division. It was here, in the forests of Tennessee and Georgia, that the strategy that would later be applied to the Great Plains was honed. On the other hand, the failure of British attempts to create a buffer Indian state showed the vulnerability of indigenous peoples in the great game of European powers. The Indians were needed by empires only as a military resource, and their interests were easily sacrificed when peace was concluded in European capitals. However, if one looks deeper, the history of Chickamauga is a story of incredible adaptability. The tribes, caught between a hammer and an anvil, displayed wonders of ingenuity. They changed combat tactics, mastered new types of weapons, and entered into complex international alliances. Their towns in the Nickajack Gorges were not primitive encampments. They were well-organized bases with food supplies, established trade routes, and an intelligence system. They used the terrain so masterfully that for many years regular armies could not inflict a decisive defeat on them. The psychological aspect of this conflict also deserves attention. Life on the frontier in those years was permeated with constant, exhausting tension. Settlers went to bed with loaded rifles, not knowing if they would live until morning. Indian families lived in constant readiness to pack up and retreat to the mountains at the approach of soldiers. This state of permanent war shaped a special type of character in people on both sides of the conflict. Tough, suspicious, prone to decisive and often cruel actions. This frontier mentality became part of the American national code, influencing the country's culture and politics long after the last shots faded. Ultimately, the history of the Chickamauga Wars makes us ponder the nature of historical memory. Why do some wars become part of the national myth, while others are forgotten? the American War of Independence is heroized, its battles known to every school child. The Chickamauga Wars, which ran parallel and were an integral part of the same process, often remain a footnote, perhaps because they reveal the uncomfortable truth that the birth of one nation meant tragedy for another. By remembering Dragging Canoe and his warriors, we restore justice, giving a voice back to those who were silenced by the triumphant fanfares of history. Their struggle was not a rebellion of savages, as contemporary colonists often portrayed it, but a conscious and organized war for sovereignty, worthy of respect and remembrance. And as long as the waters of the Tennessee flow to the ocean, they will carry a quiet story of people who preferred endless war to ignominious peace, and whose shadow still lies on the lands they called home. If one analyzes the economic underpinnings of the conflict, it becomes evident that the struggle was over resources that were critically important for both sides. For the American economy, exhausted by the war with Britain and burdened by debt, the sale of Western lands was one of the few ways to replenish the treasury and pay off veterans. Soldiers of the Continental Army were often paid not with money, which was scarce, but with land warrants. Thus, each veteran became a potential settler, personally interested in displacing the Indians. For the Chickamauga, these lands were the foundation of their traditional hunter-gatherer economy. Deer hides were the main currency in trade with Europeans, allowing them to acquire necessary goods. The reduction of hunting grounds meant not just a loss of territory, but economic collapse. It is interesting to note the role of women in this conflict. In Cherokee society, women traditionally held significant influence, having a voice in councils and deciding the fate of captives. Nancy Ward, the _0_ of the Cherokee, is a vivid example of a different survival strategy. Unlike her cousin Dragging Canoe, she advocated for peaceful coexistence and repeatedly warned settlers of impending raids. Her actions saved many lives, but also angered the war party. This internal conflict between the peace party, led by women and old chiefs, and the war party of young men, adds another layer of drama to the history of those years. The Chickamauga military actions also had a significant effect on the course of the War of Independence itself. By diverting significant militia forces from the southern colonies, they indirectly aided the British. If the thousands of people occupied with defending the frontier in Kentucky and Tennessee could have joined Washington's or Greene's army, the outcome of many battles in the East might have been different or achieved faster. The Indian frontier was that second front that constantly drained the resources of the young republic. It is not surprising that Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence mentioned merciless Indian savages as one of the reasons for the break with the king, accusing George III of inciting tribes to war. This accusation cemented the image of the Indian as an enemy of the state in the public consciousness of Americans. The end of the conflict in the 1790s coincided with fundamental changes in world politics. The French Revolution was shaking Europe, and the attention of the great powers shifted to the Old World. Spain and Britain could no longer devote as much attention to their Native American allies in America. The Chickamauga were left alone to face a strengthened and aggressive neighbor. Their defeat was predetermined not by a lack of bravery, but by global shifts they could not control. However, the spirit of resistance did not vanish without a trace. It transformed, went underground, became part of the cultural code. Stories of Dragging Canoe's exploits were passed down by word of mouth, inspiring subsequent generations. Even after the Cherokee were forced to walk the Trail of Tears, the memory that their ancestors did not surrender without a fight helped preserve national identity in exile. Today, when we look at the map of the USA, we see names of rivers, mountains, and cities with Native American roots: Tennessee, Chattanooga, Chickamauga. These names are monuments to those who lived and fought here. They remind us that the history of this land began long before Columbus's arrival, and that its pages are written not only in ink, but also in the blood of patriots from two different worlds, each fighting for their understanding of homeland. Reflecting on the finale of this epic, we come to understand the cyclical nature of history. Conflicts over resources and territories, the clash of cultures, the choice between assimilation and resistance. These themes remain relevant in the 21st century. The history of the Chickamauga Wars is a mirror in which modern humanity can see its own dilemmas. And perhaps the main lesson we can draw is the need to find ways for dialogue before conflict becomes irreversible. For the price paid by both sides in that distant war was too high, and the echo of those shots is still audible to those who know how to listen to the silence of history.